Thanks, Denise. I thought I'd start a little differently today with a joke. If you've heard it before, I'd still appreciate a courtesy laugh at the appropriate moment, but it's about three vampires. Three vampires are standing around gloating over who is the strongest. And the first vampire says, "Look, see that woman over there?" And as the two other vampires turn to look, he goes whoosh straight over to the woman. 30 seconds later, he comes back with blood dripping down his chin. He goes, "It took me only 30 seconds to completely drain her of blood." Well, the second vampire says, "That's nothing. You see that village down there?" And as the two vampires turn to look, he goes whoosh down to the village. 20 seconds later, he comes back completely covered in blood and smelling of smoke. And he said, "It only took me 20 seconds to drain the whole village, plunder the village and set it on fire." And then the third vampire says, "That's nothing." And he goes whoosh. And 2 seconds later, he comes back a total bloodied mess, bruises from head to toe. And he says, "You see that tree over there?" "Yeah, neither did I." Well, look, for the last 3 weeks, we've been looking at Hebrews chapter 11. And Hebrews chapter 11 is a chapter specifically designed to make us, the reader, strong, to make us resilient, to make us endure in our faith. And like I mentioned 2 weeks ago, the Greek word for persevere or endure is the word hypermeno. So hyper, where we get hyperactive or hypothermia from, and meno meaning to stand. And so the author's desire is for his recipients to hyperstand, all right, to be able to plant their 2 feet and have the strength to not be knocked down by anything this world or this life throws at them. And the author has been giving us example after example of this type of hyperstanding from the Old Testament. So we've seen Abel and Enoch, whose righteous actions stemmed from a right attitude. We saw that about 3 weeks ago. We looked at Noah and Abraham, who were asked to do utterly stupid things by God, like build a massive boat in the middle of the desert or kill the child of promise, and they did so. And then last week, George told us about Moses, who made the crazy decision to give up the palace to identify with his people, even though that meant becoming a slave. All right, such are the exploits of the heroes of faith. But in our passage today, our author says that's nothing. Right? You think Abraham and Moses showed heroic faith. Let me show you what real hyperstanding looks like. Now, before you say, "Oh, well, of course you're talking about Jesus, Brendan." No, I'm not. You see, the examples he gives us in this passage are of normal, sinful human beings, just like you and me, all right? But whose faith was so resilient, so hyperstanding, that the author says in verse 38, the world is not worthy of them. Now, what does that mean? Well, when you're not worthy of something, it means you don't deserve it, doesn't it? And so the author waits until the very end of the chapter to list people whose faith was a gift to the world that the world didn't deserve. All right, that's what we're looking at today. How to cultivate the kind of faith that is so hyperstanding that if we were to actually attain it, our world would not deserve us. And I've got 3 points to help us cultivate this type of faith today. You can see that on the inside of your news sheet. So we're going to begin by looking at the 2 lists that this author presents us with in this chapter. Now, he may not have picked this up, but there's actually 2 hero of faith lists in this short passage. So the first is what I'm calling conquering faith. So that's point 1. That's verse 32 to 35a. Halfway through verse 35, he starts to list a second group of people, and I've titled them undefeatable faith. So that's verse 35b to verse 38. And we're going to then conclude by seeing how it is that you and I can cultivate this kind of faith. And that's verses 39 and 40. And friends, look, if you would like the kind of faith that can conquer, the kind of faith that is undefeatable, or as the sermon title suggests, the kind of faith that perseveres, then come with me, please, as we look at conquering faith, undefeatable faith, and how to cultivate this type of faith. And our passage begins in verse 32 with the author sort of wrapping up his heroes of faith. And he says, look, I wish I had more time. I wish I had more time. So most commentators believe that the letter to the Hebrews was actually originally a sermon, not a letter. And so he's saying, look, I've only got 20 minutes here, or 25 if he's preaching at Earlwood Anglican. But what he says is, what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Right? So what he's saying is, I wish I could expand on every one of these heroes of faith, just like I did for Abraham and Moses. But what he does instead is he clumps them together, and he clumps them together because they have one thing in common. And that is, they were all weak, including Samson, yet they all conquered through their trust in the Lord. Right? So take Gideon, for example. So Gideon didn't initially trust in the Lord. That's why he put his fleece out, not once, but twice. Yet with just 300 men, each armed with nothing more than a torch and a trumpet, Gideon obeyed God and went and attacked 120,000 soldiers. Right? He was outnumbered 400 to 1. Yet he conquered. Second example, Barak. Barak didn't initially want to go to war unless he could hide behind the woman, Deborah. Yet when crunch time came, he obeyed God and led Israel's army to conquer tens of thousands of soldiers again. Samson, all right, he's physically strong, but he was a womanizer, and he could not help himself but fall for the wrong women, right, pagan women. Yet he knew his physical strength was from the Lord, and he used it to conquer God's enemies. Jephthah, he was an outlaw bikie gang member. He was an underworld figure, all right? But he then manipulated his way into power, and again, a weakness, but he recognized God's sovereignty in the past, and he fought for God's sovereignty in his day. David was a 16-year-old shepherd boy who went one-on-one against a giant SAS soldier and conquered. Samuel conquered the Philistines and administered justice. Who was it that shut the mouths of lions? Verse 33. Daniel. Who was it that conquered the flames? Verse 34. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just remember, though, that's their pagan names. That's not their godly names. We should actually be memorizing their godly names, which is Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay, commit those to memory. The prophet Elijah escaped the sword of Jezebel, just to name one of many. And the women who received their dead back was the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings 17 and the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings 4. But look, 10 examples. The one common thread with all these examples was they were all up against insurmountable odds, yet they had faith that me plus God is a majority. I'll say that again. All right, they knew the odds were clearly stacked against them, whether it be me against a giant, me against 400 to 1, me against 1,000 soldiers, or me against death itself. They all trusted, they all had faith that me plus God is a majority. They trusted God, and God intervened to help them conquer in their respective situations. So let me ask you, are you feeling weak right now? Because if so, what this passage tells us to do is remember that God can and does intervene in the lives of his people to turn their weakness into strength. Verse 34. Now, sometimes he does this by breaking the laws of nature, all right? Like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So God made the laws of nature, he can break them. But sometimes he just uses the laws of nature, like confusing an entire army so it turns on itself. All right, but the author's first list here, verses 32 to 35a, is meant to encourage us that if we come to God in our weakness, He can turn that weakness into strength and help us conquer our respective situations. So let me ask you, are you feeling weak right now? Are you feeling weak in regards to COVID maybe? See, while we cannot be certain why God has allowed COVID to come, my best guess is he has allowed COVID to come to remind us that we are not in control of this world. We are weak. And we are at the moment, all right? We're restricted. We're locked down from time to time. We're worried about getting COVID. We have trouble inviting people to church. But conquering faith will turn to God in our weakness and pray, Lord, help us to not be fools when it comes to COVID. Help us to follow the health advice, but help us to not be cowards. Help us to conquer amidst COVID for you and your kingdom. Or perhaps you're feeling weak due to illness, or work issues, or financial troubles, or relationship breakdown, or the fact that Russia has invaded a sovereign nation. See, conquering faith will turn to God, admitting our weakness, our complete inability to deal with these insurmountable odds, and ask him to intervene. Right? We can pray that God will break the laws of nature, or we can pray that God will use the laws of nature and turn our weakness into strength so that we can conquer for him and his kingdom. So that's conquering faith. And friends, we love conquering faith, don't we? We love hearing of Christians who were given just 3 months to live with stage 4 cancer, and then they blow the doctor's mind with a miraculous recovery. It happens. But here's the thing. If our faith ends at verse 35a, then we're doomed in this life. All right? We will lack the strength, the hyper standing required to make it in this life. Why? Because the vast majority of the time, our life will not end in triumph. Now, I know some Christians who, when they were going through some form of tragedy, whether it be cancer or a sick child, you name it, they had a well-meaning Christian come and say to them, look, if you have enough faith, God will heal you and everything will be okay. Now, those people were well-meaning. They were probably genuine Christians, but their faith ended at verse 35a. All right, the author saves the real heroes of faith to the last. Who are the real heroes of faith? They're the ones whom, though they were defeated, their faith wasn't. And this list starts halfway through verse 35. It starts with the word others. There were others. Now, the first example, we believe, is of an event recorded in 2 Maccabees chapter 7. Now, for those who are not aware, 2 Maccabees is one of the books of the Apocrypha. Now, the books of the Apocrypha, they were written in the intertestamental period. So you got the Old Testament, and then you got about a 400-year gap, and then you got the New Testament. Within those 400 years, there was a whole bunch of books written that they are called the book of the Apocrypha. There's about 15 of them. Now, the Roman Catholic Church takes them to be inspired scripture, and so it's part of the Roman Catholic Bible. The Protestant Church points to things like, historical and theological issues. And so what we say is, look, they're worthy of reading, but they're not part of our Bible. And in 2 Maccabees 7, we're told of a Jewish mother and her 7 sons who were tortured by the evil tyrant Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And he was trying to make them eat pork, which is against the Old Testament law, and so dishonour their Lord or be tortured to death. And from the eldest to the youngest, then finally the mother, they all refused to dishonour God and they were executed. So that's that first example there that he says, others were tortured, refusing to be released. Then he talks about people being jeered, verse 36, that was most of the prophets. The prophet Jeremiah was imprisoned. The priest Zechariah was stoned to death, verse 37. Tradition tells us the prophet Isaiah was sawed in two. The prophet Uriah was killed by the sword along with countless others in the Maccabean revolt. The sheepskin and goat skins refer to prophets like Elijah, and who, like many, had to flee persecution into the desert, living in caves. All right, now, so we've got two lists here from the Old Testament with two very different outcomes. New Testament says the exact same thing. Okay, so take Acts chapter 12, for example. In Acts chapter 12, one of Jesus' three best friends, the Apostle Peter, is put in prison by Herod to await trial and execution after the Passover. And while he's waiting in prison, God sends an angel to miraculously help him escape. Right, so the Apostle Peter is part of that first list. But you know how Acts chapter 12 starts? It starts with another of Jesus' three best mates, the Apostle James, being executed by Herod. He is of the second list. And what all these people in the second list have in common is that even though their respective situations defeated them, tortured them, killed them, their respective situations did not defeat their faith. And the reason these horrible situations didn't defeat their faith is because of one very simple fact. How do you get this kind of faith? It is because they had faith in God, not in their agenda for God. All right, so remember, conquering faith says me plus God is a majority. Undefeatable faith says my faith is in you, God, and not in my puny little agenda for you. Now, what do I mean by that? You see, people who say things like, look, I trusted God, I prayed to God, I obeyed God, and he didn't come through for me, well, that's an indicator that they don't actually care about God. They only care about their agenda for God. And their agenda is usually things like a happy life, a carefree life, a successful life, a pain-free life. And if God doesn't get on board with that agenda, then you're done with him. Now, what does that mean? It means your faith has been defeated. Right? Undefeatable faith, on the other hand, is the type of faith that does not require success. Undefeatable faith is the type of faith that cannot be killed, even if you or a loved one is. So the million-dollar question is, how do we cultivate this type of faith? Well, which type of faith do you mean, Brendan? Do you mean conquering faith or undefeatable faith? Well, they're actually one and the same thing. All right? So take Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, for example. This is what they said to Nebuchadnezzar. This is from Daniel chapter 3, verse 17. They said, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not worship your gods. All right? They believed that God would save them, but even if God chose not to, they would rather lose their lives than lose their faith. So how do we cultivate this type of faith? The kind of faith that does not stop at verse 35a, but goes all the way on to verse 38. Well, the secret to cultivating this type of faith is knowing there's a reward at the end. Right? It's like, why do runners keep running in the Boston Marathon for over 4 hours? Only a dozen of them think they might win. Well, they run because of the reward of knowing they finished. of being able to say, I ran the Boston Marathon. Right? That's how you cultivate this kind of faith. You see that there is a reward at the end. But you might ask, well, how does that work, Brendan, if death is involved? All right? What possible reward could there be if death is at stake? And the answer comes in verse 35. Have a look. Halfway through, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they may gain an even better resurrection. Now, like I said before, this verse is referring to an incident from 2 Maccabees 7. Now, I want to read to you a few verses from 2 Maccabees 7, but let me warn you, they are quite gruesome. In 2 Maccabees 7, the evil tyrant, like I said, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, told his soldiers to, quote, cut off the tongue of the one who had spoken and scalp him and chop off his hands and feet, while his mother and his 6 brothers looked on. After the young man had been reduced to a helpless mass of breathing flesh, the king gave orders for him to be carried over and thrown into one of the red-hot pans, where he died. Antiochus then did the same thing for the next 5 brothers. When he got to the youngest, Antiochus implored him to eat pork, promising him riches and power if he did. And when the boy paid no attention, Antiochus tried to persuade the boy's mother to talk him into saving his life. She agreed. Let me read you what happened. This is 2 Maccabees 7:27. Leaning over to her son, she fooled the cruel tyrant by saying in her native language, "My son, have pity on me. Remember that I carried you in my womb for 9 months and nursed you for 3 years. I have taken care of you and looked after all your needs up until the present day. And so I urge you, my child, to look at the sky and the earth. Consider everything you see there and realize that God made it all from nothing, just like he made the human race. Do not be afraid of this butcher. Give up your life willingly and prove yourself worthy of your brothers, so that by God's mercy I may receive you back with them at the resurrection." See, what gave that faithful, godly woman, along with her 7 incredible sons, undefeatable faith, was that they looked forward to a reward that outweighed even their own lives. And that was a better resurrection. Verse 35. And this is what the author wants from us as well. He wants us to cultivate the type of faith that doesn't require success. All right, the challenge the author is putting before us here is to cultivate the kind of faith that knows that our reward in heaven is infinitely better than anything this life can give us or anything death can take from us. But as good as these heroes of faith are, they're not the big gun. At the end of Iron Man 2, just when it looks like Iron Man and War Machine about to be wiped out by an army of killbots, Tony brings out the big gun, all right? And that's what the author does in our passage too. He leaves the big gun till last, and that's in verses 39 and 40. So in verse 39, he says, all of these heroes of faith died only having the promise. You see, what he means is, you and I have something they didn't. And that is, you and I have a God who suffered defeat for us. See, verse 40 talks about God having, quote, planned something better, and that something better is, again, quote, to be made perfect. See, while the saints of the Old Testament had faith that a better resurrection lay ahead of them, they had no idea what it entailed. We do, as readers of the New Testament. All right, so firstly, we know it entailed God the Son suffering the ultimate defeat. Right? If you ever find yourself wondering, what is this whole Christian message all about? This is it. Right? God the Father sent his Son to earth to be defeated, to be killed on the cross. But what's even better is why he did it. All right? Why did God choose to suffer the ultimate defeat? Well, Jesus actually tells us in John chapter 17. Let me read to you. This is John 17, verse 24. This is Jesus praying to the Father. He says, "Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am and to see my glory." Right? The reason Jesus was tortured and killed was not to force him to dishonour God. It's because he knew the only way you and I could receive a better resurrection is if he took the punishment for us dishonouring God in our sin. And why does he want us in heaven? So we can see his glory. Now think about what that means for a second. It means he wants us to experience the most delightful, euphoric, joyful experience in all of existence. And that is to enjoy the beauty, the awe, and the wonder of the Lamb who was slain for us. Do you know why Jesus still has his scars in heaven? It's because it makes him even more beautiful. Because he did it for us. And friends, that's how you cultivate conquering, undefeatable faith. We remember that spending eternity with a God who suffered ultimate defeat so that we can enjoy eternal pleasure is infinitely better than anything this life can give us or death can take from us. So may we honour the God who suffered defeat for us by ensuring that if this life defeats us, it will not defeat our faith.